The morning Louisa Winslow led her last horse to the auction block. The sky above Harrow Creek, Texas, was the color of a bruise, purple and yellow and aching, the kind of sky that had no interest in kindness. It was the spring of 1878, and the dust on Main Street had already begun its daily ritual of rising up and coating everything it touched. The rough-hewn storefronts, the iron hitching posts, the cracked leather boots of men who gathered early to watch someone else's misfortune with the comfortable detachment of those who still had something left to lose. There were plenty of those men in Harrow Creek, men who leaned against fence rails and chewed tobacco and watched the world with half-lidded eyes as though nothing surprised them anymore. Louisa had known most of them her entire life, and not one of them had offered her so much as a loaf of bread in the 3 months since her husband, Thomas Winslow, had been taken by pneumonia and left her with 40 acres of hardscrabble land, a leaking roof, and debts that had teeth. The horse's name was Calla. She was a bay mare, 12 years old, with a white blaze running down her nose like a river finding its course. Thomas had bought her as a foal from a breeder up near San Angelo, and Louisa had been there that day, 7 years married and still laughing freely, standing in a field of yellow grass while Thomas had haggled and grinned, and finally handed over more money than they could truly afford. Calla had grown into the finest horse on the Winslow property, and she had been the last to go. The oxen went to cover the feed merchant's bill. The 2 younger geldings went to cover the bank's first demand. The mule went to pay the doctor, who had come out 3 times before Thomas died anyway. Now it was Calla's turn, and Louisa held the lead rope with both hands, not because the mare was restless. Calla stood with the patience of something that understood grief, but because Louisa needed to hold onto something. She was 29 years old. She had dark auburn hair she wore pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to Thomas, a hat slightly too large for her head that she wore anyway because it was his, and because it kept the sun off her face, and because she was not yet ready to put all of him away. Her dress was clean but worn thin at the elbows, and her boots had been resoled twice. She was not a woman who had grown soft. 10 years of ranch life had made sure of that. But standing on that block, the rope in her hands and Calla blowing softly against her shoulder, she felt something inside her chest that was very close to breaking. The auctioneer, a wide man named Dobbins with a walrus mustache, and the permanent squint of a man who had spent too many years looking into the Texas sun, called out the opening bid with all the ceremony of a man reading a list of grocery items. Fine bay mare, 12 years, sound feet, good disposition, who starts me at $20. Louisa kept her face still. The crowd was not large. A dozen men, maybe 15, had gathered in the uneven space between the feed store and the livery. Some were ranchers looking for a working horse. Others were there the way people were always there at auctions, for the theater of someone else's reduced circumstances. Louisa recognized Hector Pratt near the front, a cattle broker with small eyes and large ambitions, a man who had already made 2 visits to her door since Thomas passed, first under the guise of condolence, and the second time, far less veiled, with an offer to buy her land at a price that was an insult dressed up in polite words. She had turned him away both times, and the way he was looking at Calla now told her he intended to get something from the Winslow estate whether she agreed to it or not. 20 from the gentleman in front, Dobbins called. Do I hear 25? Louisa looked out at the crowd without really seeing it. She was thinking about the 40 acres, about whether she could plant enough this season to cover the remaining debt on the property, about the roof leak above the kitchen that would become a catastrophe the moment the summer rains hit. She was doing the arithmetic of survival in her head, the way she had been doing it every waking hour for 3 months, and she was so deep in those calculations that she almost missed the voice that came from the back. 30. It was not a loud voice. It was not the voice of a man trying to be heard or noticed. It was simply a voice that spoke clearly and without hesitation, the way a man speaks when he has already made up his mind before he opened his mouth. She looked toward the sound. He was standing at the back edge of the gathered crowd, slightly apart from the others the way a man stands when he has not come to socialize. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with a lean, straight-backed build and a face that had been shaped by weather and hard work into something quiet and serious. He wore a gray shirt and dark trousers, well-worn but clean, and a wide hat that he had not removed, which was the manner of a man with no interest in ceremony. He had dark eyes and a jaw that suggested stubbornness, and he held his hat brim with 2 fingers in a gesture that was not quite a tip, more an acknowledgement that he had been seen. Louisa did not know him. 30 from the man in the back, Dobbins announced, with the mildly surprised tone of someone who had not expected the bidding to move quickly. Hector, you staying in? 35, Hector said, turning his head just enough to identify the competition and then dismissing it. 40, the man in the back said. No hesitation, no calculation, just 40, spoken with the same calm as the first bid. Hector turned fully around now. He was the kind of man accustomed to getting what he wanted through the simple application of financial pressure, and he was measuring the stranger with the practiced eye of someone who expected to be able to outspend anyone in a town like Harrow Creek. 50, Hector said. 60. There was a murmur in the crowd. $60 for a 12-year-old mare was not unreasonable, but it was approaching the territory of a statement rather than a transaction. Hector's jaw tightened. 75. The man in the back did not blink. He did not shift his weight. He simply said, $100, and the crowd went still enough that Louisa could hear Callas breathing beside her. $100 was a great deal of money in Harrow Creek in 1878. It was the kind of number that ended auctions, and it did exactly that. Hector Pratt made a sound of irritated dismissal and turned away, and Dobbins brought down his gavel with a crack that echoed off the storefront walls and declared the mare sold. Louisa stood very still for a moment. She told herself she was grateful. The $100 would clear the remaining balance on the land note at the bank and leave her with enough to repair the roof and see her through to the harvest, if the harvest came in at all. She told herself this was the best possible outcome of a situation she had not chosen. She told herself not to feel the loss of Calla as keenly as she felt it, because Calla was a horse and horses were part of the economy of ranching, and sentiment did not put food on the table. She told herself all of this very firmly, and then she pressed her face briefly against Calla's neck, breathed in the warm smell of her hay and summer and something indefinably hoarse, and handed the lead rope to Dobbins. The stranger made his way through the dispersing crowd toward the auction table. Up close, he was taller than she had realized, with a kind of economy to his movements that suggested a man who never wasted energy on what did not need doing. He paid Dobbins in cash from a plain leather wallet, counted out the bills with steady hands, and then turned to collect the lead rope. He paused when he reached Louisa because she had not moved away from the front of the table, and their eyes met at a distance of about 3 feet. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and measured, a voice that had grown accustomed to silence and was comfortable there. "I'm sorry for your circumstances." It was so direct that Louisa blinked. People in Harrow Creek were sorry for her circumstances in the way that was really about their own discomfort with her circumstances. They said it quickly and looked away and hoped she would not require anything further of them. This man said it the way you said something you actually meant. "Thank you," she said, equally direct. "She's a good horse. She'll serve you well." He looked at Calla for a moment, and something shifted in his expression, not pity, she decided, but something more like consideration. "I expect she will," he said. He took the lead rope from Dobbins, touched the brim of his hat toward Louisa, and walked Calla toward the livery. Louisa watched him go until a woman named Martha Gale materialized at her elbow with the specificity of someone who had been waiting for the transaction to be complete. "Do you know who that is?" Martha asked, in the tone of someone with information that was nearly unbearable to contain. "No," Louisa said. "That's Elijah Sutton. He bought the old Carver property out past the creek, 4 months ago or so. Came up from somewhere south, Laredo maybe, nobody's quite sure. Lives out there alone, doesn't come into town much. Calvin Doris says he came in to have a bridle repaired once and barely said 20 words the whole visit. Mrs. Doris says he's polite enough but quiet as a stone. He didn't seem unkind," Louisa said. "Well, no," Martha agreed, adjusting her view. "No, I don't suppose he seemed that. Just solitary, you know the type." Louisa knew the type. The West was full of men who had arrived from somewhere else carrying something they didn't talk about. Men who worked their land and asked little of their neighbors and wanted less asked of them. She had grown up watching such men on the periphery of town life, and she had never given them much thought, because she had been busy with her own life, with Thomas, with the ranch, with the building of something she had believed in. She collected her $100 from Dobbins, folded the bills carefully into the inside pocket of Thomas's coat, which she wore over her dress against the morning chill, and walked back to where her wagon stood hitched at the end of the street. There was nothing left to bring home. She climbed up onto the seat, took the reins, and started the long drive back to the 40 acres that were, for the moment, still hers. The road back to the Winslow Ranch followed the western bank of Harrow Creek for the first 2 miles before turning up through a stretch of live oak and cedar that gave brief, dappled shade. Louisa let the horses, a borrowed pair from her nearest neighbor, old Randall Marsh, who had no bad intentions and a great deal of practical kindness, find their own pace, and she let herself think. $100. It was enough. It was not comfortable, but it was enough. She thought about the stranger, Elijah Sutton, Martha had said, and the way he had bid without performance, without the small competitive drama that men usually brought to auctions. He had wanted the horse and he had paid for her, and that was all. There was something she respected in that straightforwardness, and she pushed the thought away because she was not in the business of forming opinions about strangers. What she was in the business of was survival, and survival had an endless list of demands. The first order of business was the bank. She drove to Harrow Creek the following morning and paid the remaining note on the land to a man named Fulton who worked behind the desk at the First Consolidated Bank of Harrow County, and who had been, in Thomas's day, pleasant enough company. He counted her money with practiced efficiency and stamped a receipt and told her the land was clear and there were no further obligations. "Clear," Louisa repeated, looking at the stamped paper in her hand. "Yes, ma'am, free and clear." She folded the receipt and placed it in the same inside pocket where she had kept the money, and she thanked Fulton and walked out of the bank into the morning sunshine, feeling something she had not felt since Thomas took sick. The flat, simple relief of a single problem being fully solved. The roof took 2 weeks to repair, because the extent of the damage was worse than she had feared, and the carpenter she hired, a slow but thorough man named Grady, worked at the pace of something geological. But the job was done right, and when the spring rains came, the kitchen stayed dry, and Louisa stood in the middle of the room and listened to the rain on the roof and felt a complicated version of gratitude. She planted corn and sorghum on 20 acres of the 40, with a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, and she put in the work with her own hands because there was no one to help her. She rose before dawn and went to bed after dark, and her hands grew calloused and her back ached, and she was so tired by the end of each day that grief had to wait in line behind exhaustion for access to her. This was, she had come to understand, both the hardship and the mercy of having too much to do. She had been at it about 2 weeks past the auction when she came out of the barn one morning to find a horse standing in her yard. Not a strange horse. She recognized the white blaze immediately, the patient dark eyes, the way the mare stood with that particular quiet confidence. Calla was standing in her yard and Elijah Sutton was standing beside her, holding the lead rope, and he looked at Louisa with an expression that was careful and serious. "Mr. Sutton," she said, and she was too surprised to be anything but plain about it. "That is my horse." "She was your horse," he said. "Now she's mine. I bought her." He paused. "But I've been thinking about that since the day of the auction, and I've decided I don't want to keep what was yours if I can help it." Louisa looked at him for a long moment. "You paid $100 for her." "I did. That was a fair price, a more than fair price." "I know it was." He was not awkward about this, which surprised her. He stood with the rope in his hand and met her eyes steadily. "I don't need the horse. I've got 2 good ones already. I bought her because I could see that Pratt fellow was going to get her, and it seemed wrong to let that happen. I don't think I can quite explain it better than that." Louisa felt something shift in her chest, some small tectonic thing. She said nothing for a moment because she was thinking very carefully about what this meant and what it did not mean, and she was a woman who had learned to think before she spoke. "I can't pay you back," she said finally. "I used that money for the land note. I'm not asking you to pay me back. I'm returning your horse." "That's $100 gift, Mr. Sutton." "I suppose it is. I don't take charity." He considered that. He looked down at the rope in his hand and then back at her, and there was something almost like the beginning of a smile at the edge of his mouth, though it did not fully arrive. "What if it's not charity? What if it's just something a neighbor does for another neighbor? We've never spoken before this moment." "No," he agreed. "But I've been your neighbor for 4 months, and I know you've been having a hard year, and I have more than I need. That's the whole of it. There's nothing complicated in it." Louisa looked at Calla, who was looking back at her with the expression of a horse that has been in several homes in the last 2 weeks and has opinions about the matter. She looked at Elijah Sutton, who was watching her with those dark, patient eyes that gave nothing away except the simple fact that he was telling her the truth. "I'm going to plant 60 acres this season," she said. "I'm going to need a horse that knows this land." "She knows it," he said, and handed Louisa the lead rope. Their fingers overlapped on the rope for just a moment, and then Louisa stepped back and said, "Thank you, Mr. Sutton," and he touched his hat brim and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Winslow," and turned and walked back to where he had left his own horse tied at the gate. She watched him go, and Calla pressed her nose against Louisa's shoulder, and Louisa reached up and ran her hand down the mare's blaze and stood there in the morning quiet for a long time. She saw him again 3 weeks later in town, outside the general store, where he was loading supplies into his wagon with the efficient, unhurried manner she was beginning to associate with him. She had come in for seed and flour and a small amount of coffee, which had become a luxury she was rationing carefully. He saw her when she came out of the store with her own parcels, and he crossed the street without particular hurry and took the heavier bag from her arms without asking permission, which ought to have annoyed her and for some reason did not. "Your crop coming in?" he asked, as they loaded the parcels into her wagon. "Slowly," she said. "The corn is stronger than I expected. The sorghum is taking its time. First season alone." "Yes." He nodded the way he nodded at things, not with the performative understanding of a man trying to demonstrate sympathy, but with the acknowledgement of a man who has heard a fact and filed it accurately. "The second season is easier," he said, "once you know what the land needs." "Is that experience talking?" "Some of it." He looked down the street rather than at her, and she had the impression of a man choosing how much to say. "I farmed outside Laredo for 6 years before I came up here. Different soil, different climate, but the principle is the same. Land has a rhythm, takes time to learn it." "What brought you to Harrow Creek?" He was quiet for a moment. "Ready for something different, I suppose." He said it simply, without invitation for further inquiry, and she did not press him because she understood that kind of answer. She had given versions of it herself when people asked about Thomas, asking with that particular social hunger that had more to do with the pleasure of a sad story than with any genuine care. "Well," she said, "Harrow Creek is different from most places." The almost smile appeared at the corner of his mouth again. "I've noticed." "In what way?" "In the way that everyone here has known everyone else for 30 years, and they've all got opinions about each other, and they hold onto those opinions like a man holds onto a debt." Louisa laughed. It surprised her. She had not laughed in a genuine, unguarded way in months, and the sound of her own laughter was almost startling. That is the most accurate description of this town I have ever heard." He looked at her then, and for just a moment the careful composure in his face opened into something warmer, something that was not quite yet the smile but was clearly in the neighborhood of one, and he said, "I'm glad I didn't offend you. It would take more than the truth to offend me, Mr. Sutton." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the wagon seat while he'd loaded the parcels, and he put it back on, and he said, "Good day, Mrs. Winslow," and climbed up onto his wagon, and she watched him drive away with the same feeling she had noticed after the auction, and after the morning he returned calla, a sort of clarified attention, as though the air had sharpened slightly. The summer of 1878 in Harrow Creek was a long and punishing thing, the kind of summer that tested every living being that had the misfortune of being in its presence. The heat came down in waves from a white sky, and the creek dropped to a thin thread by July, and Louisa carried water to her kitchen garden by hand, because the difference between a full crop and a failed one could be measured in effort, and she had plenty of that. She saw Elijah Sutton with some regularity through those months, because the Carver property, his property, she reminded herself. She needed to stop calling it the Carver property, shared a fence line with her northern pasture, and there were practical matters that occasionally required the kind of conversation that neighbors have. A fence post that had come down in a storm, a question about water rights to the creek that bisected the property boundary, a mutual observation about the terrible quality of the summer. She noticed things about him the way you notice things about a person you see regularly without occasion to know them well. He was a careful and thorough worker. The fence lines on his side were straight, and the posts were set deep, and the wire was tight. He did not waste movement or speech. He was kind to his animals in the plain, practical way of someone who understood that kindness was also efficiency. Well-treated animals worked better and longer. He did not seem to want anything from her, which was its own form of distinction in a world where most people wanted something. Once in July, she came out of her house at an unusual hour past midnight, because the heat was too much to sleep through, and she had taken to sitting on the porch in the late night, and she saw lamplight burning in the window of the Carver, his house. She corrected herself again. She sat on her porch in the dark and watched that small yellow rectangle of light for a while, and she wondered what a man alone read by lamplight after midnight, and then she felt slightly embarrassed about the wondering and went back inside. She was not in the business of loneliness. She told herself this regularly. Thomas had been gone 6 months. She was not the first woman in the history of the American West to lose a husband and be left to make something of the wreckage, and she would not be the last. She had her work and her land and calla and the neighbors she trusted, and the fundamental practical intelligence that had always served her better than sentimentality. Still, the lamps burned on, down past the fence line, past the dark line of live oaks, and she was only human. It was August when the trouble with Hector Pratt clarified itself into something that could not be navigated with politeness. He came to her door on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 men she did not recognize, not large men exactly, but with the specific quality of people being paid for their presence rather than their conversation. And he stood on her porch and told her, in the careful language of someone who had thought about how to say it, that he had spoken to certain parties at the county courthouse, and believed there might be a question about the exact boundaries of her land deed, and that such questions, in his experience, had a tendency to become expensive to resolve unless addressed cooperatively. Louisa stood in her doorway and looked at Hector Pratt and felt something cold move through her, the specific chill of a threat dressed up in civil language. "My deed is clear," she said, "registered at the bank and at the county recorder's office." "Yes, well, there's a deed and then there's a survey, and if the survey were to be contested, then I would contest the contestation," she said. "With a lawyer in court, and with the original survey papers that are in my possession, and that I will not be giving to anyone." Hector Pratt looked at her for a moment with those small, flat eyes, and she could see him recalibrating. He had expected, perhaps, a woman more frightened or more tired than she was. He had perhaps expected the accumulated weight of a hard year to have made her more willing to take whatever was offered and be grateful. "Think about it, Mrs. Winslow," he said, and the two men with him made no move and said nothing, because they were furniture, not participants. "I'm offering you a fair price." "You offered me a price that was 30% below market value," she said. "That is not a fair price." "Good afternoon, Mr. Pratt." She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her back against the wood, breathing carefully. Then she crossed to the kitchen and set a pot of water on the stove for coffee, because her hands were shaking slightly, and making coffee gave them something useful to do. She sat at the table with the coffee and thought about this for a long time. She was not frightened exactly, but she was not comfortable either. Hector Pratt had money and connections in Harrow County, and a reputation for getting what he wanted through the kind of patient administrative pressure that was difficult to fight because it did not announce itself clearly as a fight. She had the deed, clearly registered, and she had Thomas's original survey papers in a tin box under the floorboard of the bedroom. But she also knew that in 1878 in West Texas, a woman alone with a clear deed was not automatically safe from a man with money and patience, and two men he was paying to stand beside him on porches. She thought about it for several days before she did anything, and what she finally did was ride the fence line to the northern boundary of her property and call out for her neighbor. Elijah Sutton came out from behind the barn when she called, wiping his hands on a cloth, and he walked to the fence and stood on his side of it and looked at her with the attentive calm she had come to expect from him. "I have a problem," she said, "and I am not asking for your help. I am asking for your advice, because you're a man who appears to use good judgment, and I find I could use a second perspective." Something in his expression acknowledged both the request and the qualifier. He leaned on the fence post. "Tell me about it." She told him about Hector Pratt, about the 2 visits, about the implied threat to contest the survey, about the men on the porch. She told him plainly and without embellishment, because he was not the kind of man who needed drama in a story to understand its weight. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is your survey paper in Thomas's name or in both names?" "Both names," Thomas insisted. "Good. Under Texas law at present, as a widow you inherit the property outright with a joint deed. Pratt knows that. He's hoping you don't." He paused. "Do you know a lawyer? There's a man named Whitfield in Harrow Creek. Thomas used him twice. Go see Whitfield. Have him write a letter to the county recorder affirming the deed status and requesting that any third-party survey challenges require formal written notice to you and your legal representative. It costs very little, and it makes the administrative route considerably less comfortable for Pratt." "That's practical advice," Louisa said. "It's a practical problem." She looked at him across the fence. The afternoon light was coming from behind her, and she could see his face clearly. The way he was taking this seriously, applying the same quiet attention he seemed to apply to everything, the furrow between his brows that appeared when he was thinking something through. "Can I ask you something else?" she said. "Go ahead." "Why did you buy my horse?" The question surprised him slightly. She could see it in the small pause before he answered, the brief reassembly of his expression. "I told you already. You told me the reason you gave me. I'm asking for the real one." He was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his hands on the fence post. Then he looked back up at her, and there was something different in his expression now, not the careful composure, but something underneath it, something that had decided to come to the surface for the first time. "I saw your face when they called the opening bid," he said. "And I thought, that is a woman who is going to lose this horse, and it is going to hurt her, and there is absolutely no reason it has to happen that way, that's all." It was a simple thing to say, and it was not somehow a simple thing at all. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Sutton, for all of it." "Elijah," he said. It was not a command, just a suggestion, offered the way he offered most things, without pressure, without expectation. "Louisa," she said. The almost smile arrived with full force this time, and it changed his face entirely, opening something that had been held carefully in place, and she thought suddenly that it was a very good smile, the kind that had been earned rather than practiced. She went to see Whitfield the next morning, and he wrote the letter with professional efficiency and sent copies to the county recorder and to Hector Pratt's business address, and Hector Pratt did not appear on her porch again that season. He was not finished. She was not naive enough to think so, but the letter had at minimum clarified the cost of the administrative route and given him something to think about. The corn came in at the end of September in quantities that were better than she had hoped for and not as good as she had needed, but the shortfall was manageable if she was careful with her winter spending, and careful was something she had become extremely good at. The sorghum was more modest, but sorghum was sorghum, and she sold what she had at the Harrow Creek market and put the money away in the tin box next to the survey papers. It was at the harvest market that she spent 3 hours in proximity to Elijah Sutton, who had brought a load of his own corn and who was set up 2 stalls down from her own. It was the first time she had been near him for any sustained period. The fence conversations were brief by nature, interrupted by the demands of 2 properties that needed tending, and she found herself noticing between her own transactions the way he spoke to buyers, directly, without the inflated claims that characterized most vendor patter, simply stating the quality of what he had and the price he wanted and leaving the buyer to make up their own mind. He sold out by noon. He came and stood beside her table when his stall was cleared, and helped her with the afternoon volume without being asked, weighing corn and making change with the same steady competence he brought to everything, and she found that having him there did not make her feel crowded, which was unusual. Most people's proximity eventually produced in her a mild desire for them to be somewhere else. His was different. It was the company of someone who did not demand anything from the space around him. After the market, she bought 2 cups of coffee from a stall near the town square and brought him one, and they sat on the edge of a water trough in the late afternoon heat and drank their coffee and talked about the harvest and the coming winter and the state of the southern range. And it was the most ordinary conversation she had had in a very long time, and she was astonished by how much she had missed ordinary conversation. "How did you end up in Laredo?" she asked at some point and then caught herself. "I'm sorry, that's probably none of my business. I was born there," he said. "My father had a ranch outside of town, small operation, horses mainly. He died when I was 20 and left it to me and my brother and I did not see eye to eye on much of anything, so eventually I bought his half and ran it alone for a while." He paused, "and then I decided I wanted to try something different. You had no family keeping you there." "I had a wife," he said, and he said it the way you say a thing that has passed, with the specific flatness of old grief. "She died. It was a few years back now." Louisa looked at him. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," he said, and he said it the way he had said everything that mattered, simply, without decoration, with the weight it deserved. "It was a fever. 3 days and then she was gone." "These things happen." "Yes," Louisa said, "they do." They were quiet for a moment, sitting in the dusty afternoon with their coffee cups in their hands, and the understanding that passed between them in that silence was the particular understanding of people who have lost something that did not have to be named because both of them already knew its shape. "Your Thomas," he said, "was he a good man?" "He was a very good man," she said, without hesitation. "Impractical in some ways. He always thought the next season would be the good one, that we were always one good harvest from being comfortable. But he worked hard and he loved this land and he never once said an unkind word to me in 10 years. That's rarer than people say it is." "It is," Elijah agreed. "Was your wife, what was her name?" "Clara." "Was Clara happy there in Laredo?" He thought about this genuinely, not rushing to the comfortable answer. "I think she was content," he said finally. "Clara was a person who made the best of wherever she was. I don't know if I ever managed to give her more than that." There was something in the way he said it, a quiet, carried weight that she recognized because it was the same thing she carried herself in the middle of the night when the arithmetic of the past replayed itself without her permission, the particular accounting of whether you had been enough. "You strike me," she said carefully, "as a man who would have given more if he could have." He looked at her. "You don't know me that well." "No," she said. "But I've watched you work for 6 months, and I've never seen you do less than everything a thing requires. I suspect you were the same kind of husband." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's a generous thing to say." "It's an honest thing to say," she said. "I told you it would take more than the truth to offend me, but I meant it both ways. The truth doesn't offend me when it's good either." The almost smile was back, and she was beginning to like it very much, the way it arrived slowly, like something that had decided it was safe to come out. October came in cooler than September, which was a mercy, and with it came the particular rhythm of the pre-winter period. Firewood, mending, the last of the canning, the winterizing of the barn. Louisa worked through it with her head down and her hands busy, and every few days she would see Elijah at the fence line or in town on a supply run, and their conversations had grown from the careful, practical exchanges of neighbors into something that had the texture of friendship, real friendship, with the lightness and the depth that word ought to imply. He fixed part of her fence one afternoon when she was dealing with a problem in the kitchen garden. Simply fixed it because it needed fixing and he was there. And she made him dinner for it, a proper dinner, the first she had cooked for company since Thomas died. And they sat at her kitchen table with the lamp between them and ate venison stew and cornbread and talked for 3 hours. He told her about growing up in Laredo, about the horses his father had raised, about a summer he had spent working cattle drives at 17, because he had been convinced that the open range was where he wanted to spend his life. She told him about growing up in San Marcos, where her father had been a schoolteacher with 4 children and too many books, about meeting Thomas at a church social when she was 18, about the early years of the ranch when they had had nothing but the land and each other and the determination to make it into something. "You sound like you don't regret it," he said. "Not a day of it," she said. "Even now, even with everything. This land is mine, really mine, and I know every inch of it. That's not nothing." "It's a great deal," he said, and he meant it. He left at 9 o'clock, stepping out into the cool October night, and she stood in the doorway watching him walk to his horse in the darkness. And when he swung up into the saddle, he paused and looked back at her in the doorway light, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he touched his hat the way he did, and she said, "Good night, Elijah," and he said, "Good night, Louisa," and he rode into the dark toward the carver, toward his property, and she really needed to stop that. She stood in the doorway after he was gone and listened to the November approaching in the wind from the north, the smell of cold and grass in it, and she was aware, for the first time, with clear and naming attention, that she was looking forward to seeing him again. This awareness was both welcome and alarming. It was welcome because it meant something in her was still alive, still capable of turning toward warmth the way a plant turns toward light. It was alarming because she was 29 years old and 7 months a widow, and she was not, she told herself firmly, in any position to be feeling things about a neighbor. The feeling, being uninterested in her position, continued to exist. November brought a cold that settled into the bones of the land and made the mornings a test of will. Louisa rose early anyway, because the stock still needed tending and the wood still needed splitting, and the ranch did not care about comfort. She had 3 chickens now acquired through a trade with Randall Marsh's wife, and a pig she had purchased at the fall market and was fattening toward December. These small additions to the property gave her a satisfaction that was out of proportion to their economic value, because they meant that the land was generating life again, that the attrition of the past year had finally stopped, and the rebuilding had begun. Elijah came over one Saturday in early November with a tool she had mentioned needing, a particular type of saw for the firewood work, and they spent the afternoon cutting wood together, the two of them working in a comfortable rhythm that had developed with the ease of something natural. He was good company in the way that quiet people are sometimes specifically good company, present without being demanding, observant without being intrusive, capable of sitting in comfortable silence while they worked. In the afternoon, they rested against the woodpile and she brought out cider and they sat in the thin November sun. And he said, without any particular preamble, "I've been thinking about something." She waited. "I've been thinking that this past year you've had to carry a great deal without any help, and I think you've done it extraordinarily well, and I think you're going to be just fine." She looked at him. "That's a kind thing to say." "I'm not saying it to be kind. I'm saying it because it's true and I thought you might want to hear it." "Why today?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his cider cup in his hands. "Because I've been watching you for 6 months and I've wanted to say it for most of that time and I haven't, and today seemed like the day." The afternoon light was long and golden, the way November light is in Texas, slanted and warm in color if not in temperature, and it fell across his face and the woodpile and the frost-edged grass and made everything look briefly burnished. Louisa looked at this man, at his honest, serious face, at the hands wrapped around the cider cup, at the way he was looking at her with those dark eyes that had always given her the impression of depth, as though there was considerably more going on below the surface than what he was choosing to show, and she made a decision. "Elijah," she said. "Yes. If you wanted to come to dinner again next week, you would be welcome to." He was still for a moment. Then the smile came, the full version of it, the one that changed his face entirely, the one that had been arriving in increments over 6 months and was now finally, wholly present. "I would like that," he said. He came to dinner the following Friday, and the Friday after that, and the pattern established itself with the ease of something that had been waiting for permission. They cooked together sometimes. She taught him how she made the venison stew with the peppers, and he showed her a way to make cornbread that was better than her own, and she told him so, which made him laugh, which she had decided was one of her favorite sounds because he laughed rarely and thus genuinely. They talked about everything. About the land, about the county, about the larger world beyond Harrow Creek that was changing fast in 1878, the railroads coming through, the cattle trails moving north, the ranching economy that was reorganizing itself around new money and new routes that were not always kind to the small, independent operation. They talked about politics and about the injustices she had seen plainly, the way the Comanche and Kiowa had been pressed from this land by force within their own lifetimes, and what that meant about the nature of ownership and belonging. And Elijah listened to her with the attentiveness of a man who had thought about these things himself, and had the humility to know that thinking about them was not the same as resolving them. "My father had a neighbor outside Laredo," he said once. "A Mexican family, the Cruces, who had been on their land since before Texas was Texas. After the war, men came and simply claimed it with paperwork that may or may not have been legitimate, and the Cruces family had no recourse that mattered. They left." He paused. "That family had been on that land for 3 generations. It was wrong, and the law shrugged at it." "The law shrugs at a great deal that is wrong," Louisa said, "which is why I was so determined to have my deed in order." "Which is exactly why you should have it in order," he agreed. "Because the law is a tool, and like any tool it can be used well or badly, and you have to know how it works before you can use it for yourself." These conversations had the quality of things she had not known she had been missing, the engagement of a mind that took her thinking seriously, that disagreed with her when it disagreed and agreed when it agreed, and never once gave her the impression that her opinions were being processed as the acceptable productions of a woman whose role was to have opinions that did not inconvenience anyone. It was December when Hector Pratt made his 3rd attempt. He filed a formal survey challenge at the county courthouse, as Whitfield had warned her he eventually might. A paper claiming that the eastern boundary of her property was misdescribed in the original deed, and that approximately 8 acres of her best planting land actually fell within the boundaries of an adjacent property he was in the process of acquiring. Whitfield sent her a letter about it on a Thursday, and she read it twice at the kitchen table and then sat very still for a moment, and felt the fear that she had been keeping at arm's length move closer. She rode to see Whitfield that afternoon, and he explained the mechanism. Pratt had hired a survey firm out of Austin, not a local one, specifically not a local one, and filed their findings with the county recorder. Whitfield believed the survey was fraudulent, that it had been commissioned to produce a particular conclusion rather than to find a true one. But proving that would require hiring their own survey firm and presenting the counter-findings to a county judge. And the county judge, Whitfield said with the careful language of a man who dealt in realities, was not precisely neutral where Hector Pratt was concerned. "What does that mean?" Louisa asked. Whitfield folded his hands on his desk. "It means we can fight this, and we should fight this, and I believe we will prevail. But it will take time and it will cost money, and Pratt knows both of those things." "How much money?" he told her. It was more than she had in the tin box. She rode home in the gray December afternoon and fed Calla and the chickens and the pig, and made herself dinner, and sat at the table afterward in the lamplight, and looked at the walls of the house that Thomas had built, and she thought about all the things she was not going to do, which were panic, give in, sell, or accept a price that was wrong just because the right price was temporarily beyond her reach. Then she put on her coat and walked the fence line to the northern boundary in the dark. There was a light in Elijah's window. She called his name, and after a moment he appeared at the fence with a lantern, and she told him what Whitfield had said directly and plainly, as she always told him things. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set the lantern on the fence post and said, "A survey firm out of Austin." It was not a question. "Yes." "Whitfield says the findings are designed to reach a conclusion rather than to find a truth. Have you seen the survey papers Pratt filed? Whitfield has copies. I know a man in San Antonio who does survey work. Honest work, the kind that produces findings based on what is actually true rather than what someone paid to find. I worked with him once when there was a boundary question on the Laredo property." He paused. "I can write him, have him come out. That's Whitfield's recommendation as well. The question is the cost." Elijah looked at her across the fence in the lamplight. "I can cover the cost," he said. "No," she said immediately and clearly. "Louisa, I will not take more from you. You returned my horse. You fixed my fence. You have been a better neighbor than anyone has any right to expect, and I am grateful for every bit of it, but I am not going to let you pay for my legal fight." "Then consider it a loan," he said. "At what terms?" "At the terms of repayment whenever you have it, without interest, on your schedule, with no expectation except that you use it." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind off the north was cold, the kind of cold that came down from the plains without apology, and the lamplight was warm between them on the fence post, and she was aware of the particular quality of this moment. The way this man was standing in the dark, offering her the thing she needed without attaching strings to it, without wanting anything back except her success. "Why do you care what happens to my land?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the live oaks. Calla, who had followed Louisa to the fence, shifted in the dark behind her. "I think you know why," he said. She did know. She had known for a while. She had been choosing not to know it, carefully, deliberately, the way you choose not to look at something until you are ready for what it means. "Elijah," she said, "I'm not asking you for anything," he said quickly. "I know it's too soon, and I know you've had a hard year, and I'm not. I know you're not asking," she said. "I know. But I want to tell you something anyway." He waited. "That dinner next week," she said. "I've been looking forward to it since last week's dinner ended. I've been looking forward to every conversation we've had at this fence, and at the harvest market, and at my kitchen table. I look out at the light in your window, and I'm glad it's there." She paused. "That is the most honest thing I've told anyone in a long time." In the lamplight she could see what happened to his face when she said that, the careful composure dissolving, the thing underneath it coming fully and openly to the surface, something warm and certain and, she thought, deeply relieved. "I'm glad to hear it," he said. "Now loan me the money for the survey," she said, "and I'll have Whitfield write up proper terms." He laughed, the full laugh. rare and genuine, and the sound of it went out into the cold night and dispersed among the live oaks, and she stood at the fence and felt something in her chest that was wholly new and wholly good. The survey man from San Antonio was named Douglas Crane, and he arrived in early January 1879 with his instruments and his notebooks and a professional thoroughness that impressed Louisa immediately. He spent 3 days on her property, running precise measurements along every boundary, cross-checking the original deed descriptions, noting the creek's position and the survey markers that Thomas had placed, some of which were still clearly visible in the ground. Elijah was there on the second day, because she had asked him to be, and he walked the boundary with Crane and asked the kinds of questions that came from someone who had dealt with land surveys before, practical, technical, useful questions. Crane looked at Elijah with something that seemed like mild professional respect, which was not a quality Louisa had seen him extend casually. By the third day, Crane had completed his work, and his findings were unambiguous. The Winslow deed was accurate and complete, the eastern boundary was correctly described, and the Austin survey firm's claimed discrepancy appeared to be based on a set of marker placements that had no historical foundation. The markers they referenced, Crane said, spreading his notes on Louisa's kitchen table, are not original. Based on the weathering and the materials, I estimate they were placed within the last 6 to 8 months. These are not property boundary markers. These are manufactured evidence. Louisa sat with this for a moment. Someone placed false markers on my land. On the boundary of your land, yes. I suspect at Pratt's direction. That's fraud, Elijah said, from the other side of the table. It is, Crane agreed. It's also the kind of fraud that's difficult to prosecute directly, because proving who placed the markers requires a witness or an admission, neither of which you are likely to obtain. What you can do is use my survey findings to definitively counter the challenge in court, at which point the judge will have to decide between 2 competing surveys, and given the quality of the evidence, any fair-minded judge will find in your favor. And if the judge is not fair-minded, Louisa asked, then you appeal to the state level, and at the state level, evidence of manufactured markers is considerably more compelling because there are people at the state level who would be very interested in a survey firm that produces false findings. Whitfield took Crane's report and filed it formally at the county courthouse. The case went to Judge Harmon Dill, who was, as Whitfield had warned, not entirely neutral. Judge Dill took 3 weeks to review the competing surveys. He then, perhaps aware that an appeal would bring scrutiny that was inconvenient for everyone involved, ruled that the Austin survey's findings were insufficiently established and dismissed Pratt's challenge. Louisa received the ruling on a cold February morning and sat at her kitchen table and read it 3 times. She rode to Elijah's property in the afternoon, and he came out of the barn when she rode up and looked at her face, which she had not arranged into neutrality, and he said, "Good news." "Very good news," she said, and she held up the paper. He read it quickly. Then he looked up at her, and she was down from Cala by then, standing in his yard, and he crossed the distance between them and did something she had not expected. He took her face in both his hands very gently and said nothing at all, just looked at her. His hands were warm and his eyes were dark, and she could feel the weight of everything the year had been in that touch, and she put her own hands over his and felt the steadiness of them. "It's over," she said. "It's over," he agreed. He let go of her face slowly, and she stepped back, and they were both smiling in the cold February sunlight, and Cala blew loudly in the general direction of Elijah's horses, which made them both laugh. "Come to dinner," she said. "Tonight. I'll cook something that isn't venison stew. What do you have in mind?" "I have a chicken I've been saving. A special occasion chicken. It is a special occasion." The dinner that evening had a different quality than the previous Fridays. The previous Fridays had been the careful, beautiful building of something, the accumulation of knowledge and comfort and trust, the slow flowering of something that did not need to be named to be real. Tonight there was a light quality to it, a celebration quality, as though the removal of the pressure they had both been living under had made space for something lighter and more joyful to breathe. They talked about spring, about what she planned to plant and what he was expanding on his own property. He had decided to add horses to his operation, which made her smile because it was, she thought, entirely characteristic. They talked about the county fair in April, which Louisa had not attended since Thomas died and which Elijah had never attended because he had not yet arrived at the social conviction that Harrow Creek events were worth his time. "Come with me," she said. He looked at her across the table. "To the fair?" "Yes." "Together?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched his face with the attention she had developed over months of learning what his expressions meant. This one was careful happiness, the kind that moves slowly because it has been hurt before and has learned to approach good things with caution. "People will talk," he said. "People in Harrow Creek talk about everything," she said. "Martha Gale has probably already composed 3 different theories about why you ate dinner here on 7 different Fridays. I don't intend to manage what people say. I intend to go to the county fair with a man I want to go with, and if that produces conversation, I will endure it." "You're sure?" "Elijah," she said, and she said his name the way she had learned to say it, not calling for him, just saying it, because it fit what she meant. "I am very sure." The almost smile arrived and became the full smile, and the full smile became something else, something open and warm and wholly unguarded, and she thought that she had very much earned this particular version of his face, and she was glad. The spring came on in 1879 with a generosity that felt almost like apology after the previous year's punishments. The rains came at the right intervals, the temperatures built steadily rather than lunging into heat, and by March the land was doing what it could do when the conditions were cooperative, which was to say it was doing everything. Louisa planted 60 acres. She hired 2 young men from town for the heavy work, brothers named Pete and Sam Greer, who were capable and reliable, and who asked no more questions than the job required. And she and Elijah worked their own fields in parallel, close enough to call across the fence when something needed consulting. And the rhythm of the spring was the rhythm of 2 operations running alongside each other, with the easy competence of people who had learned to work in proximity. He asked her to go riding on a Sunday in late March, on a day when the work was caught up enough to permit leisure, and they rode the length of the creek together, Calla and Elijah's gray gelding he called Roan, which was not the most creative name but was at least accurate. The creek was running full from the spring rains, the banks lined with the early green of new growth, and the sky was the clean, brilliant blue that Texas achieves in March as though compensating for its usual extremes. They rode without agenda, which was rare for both of them, and after a while they stopped on the bank of the creek where a large flat stone provided a natural seat, and they sat there with the horses drinking at the water's edge and the sun warm on their faces. He said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. She had learned that he always came to things in his own time, and there was no advantage in rushing him. "I know it's been less than a year since Thomas died," he said. "I want to acknowledge that plainly. I don't want to be a man who ignores what that means." "Elijah, let me finish." He looked at the creek. "I have not been in the habit of planning for the future. After Clara died, I mostly thought in terms of the next season, the next practical requirement. I stopped thinking past that because it seemed unnecessary." He paused. "This year I've started thinking past that again, and the shape of what I'm thinking about has you in it." Louisa looked at his profile, the serious lines of his face, the way the March light fell across his jaw and the edge of his hat, and she thought about everything the year had carried. The auction and the horse and the $100 and the fence conversations and the dinners and the cold night at the boundary and his hands on her face in February. "The shape of what I'm thinking about has you in it too," she said. He turned to look at her. "It does." "Yes." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that on the flat stone by Harrow Creek with the horses drinking and the spring running and the long open country of West Texas laid out around them with all its difficulty and all its beauty, and it was enough. It was entirely enough. He proposed to her properly in April, on the evening before the county fair, standing at her kitchen door with his hat in his hand, and a directness that she would not have had from him any other way. "I know this is fast," he said. "I know it has been less than a year. I know you don't need anyone. You have demonstrated that beyond any reasonable doubt. But I would like to spend the rest of my life farming next to you, and talking to you, and being the man who has the extraordinary good fortune of being the person you come to when things go wrong or right. I would like to do that with the full, honest commitment of marriage, if you'll have it." "I'll have it," she said. He put his hat back on, which she found deeply characteristic, and he said, "Tomorrow at the fair, then." "Tomorrow at the fair," she agreed. "And now come inside and eat something because you clearly haven't had dinner." They were married in June of 1879, in a small ceremony at the Harrow Creek Church, with Whitfield and his wife as witnesses and Randall Marsh and Martha Gale in the pews, and the Greer brothers standing at the back in their good shirts. The preacher was a spare man named Connolly who had the good sense to keep his remarks brief, and when Elijah put the ring on Louis's finger, a plain gold band that had belonged to his mother, which she had asked for instead of a new one because she liked the history of it, she looked at his face and saw the same thing she had seen at the creek in March. A man who had come back to something he had thought was lost, steady and certain and fully present. They combined the properties after the wedding, which was the practical decision and also the right one. The fence between the two operations came down, and 60 acres became 100, and the increased scale made things possible that had been marginal before. Elijah was good with horses, as he had always been, and the breeding operation he had been slowly building became something real with the additional pasture. Louis's corn and sorghum filled the north fields, and together they had the kind of balanced operation that was actually sustainable, not the constant knife edge of the past year. The summer of 1879 was warm and full, and had the quality of a long exhale. Hector Pratt made no further trouble. He had turned his ambitions toward a ranch further south that had fewer defenders, and Louisa heard through Martha Gale's extensive information network that he had run into his own difficulties with the county surveyor's office, the details of which were not entirely clear, but which seemed to involve the kind of administrative attention he had hoped to direct at others. She felt something that was not quite satisfaction at this news but was adjacent to it, and she let it go because she had better things to think about. In October, Louisa told Elijah that she was pregnant. She had suspected it for 2 weeks before she told him, turning the knowledge over carefully, examining it from all its angles, understanding what it meant in terms of the practical demands of the next year and beyond. She told him on a Sunday evening after dinner at the kitchen table that had become the site of so many of their best conversations, and she watched his face when she told him. He was still for a moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. "I'm perfectly well." He reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and he said nothing for a moment, just held them, and she watched the news move through him, the careful, controlled man opening to this with the same slow fullness he brought to everything, not effusive but genuine, deeply, wholly genuine. "We'll need to expand the house," he said finally. She laughed. "That is the first thing you say. I'm thinking practically." "You are always thinking practically." "Someone in this house needs to," he said. And he was smiling, the full smile, and she leaned across the table and kissed him because she felt like it, and because she could. The winter of 1879 passed in the warmth of a house that had 2 people in it who were working together, not against the world separately. Elijah built out the east side of the house through December and January, adding a second room that was solid and well-made and warm, because he built things the way he did everything, thoroughly, with intention to last. She grew large through the winter, and he took on more of the heavy work without comment or complaint, and she let him because she was practical about what her body needed and not sentimental about who did what. They read together in the evenings, from the small collection of books that represented both their libraries combined, And they argued amiably about the books and about farming and about county politics and about nothing in particular. And the arguments were the kind between two people who respect each other too much to be dishonest. In March of 1880, their son was born. The labor was long and Louisa was strong throughout it, and the woman who came to assist, a midwife named Nettie Coles, who had delivered half the children in Harrow County, with the competence of someone who treated birth as a practical matter to be managed with skill and calm, declared the baby healthy and well-formed, and handed him to his mother with the professional satisfaction of a job done right. Elijah was in the room, at Louisa's insistence and Nettie's resigned permission, and when Nettie put the baby in Louisa's arms and Louisa looked down at this new person, she heard Elijah make a sound beside her, not a word, not really a sound at all, just an involuntary release of breath, and she looked up and saw his face, and she thought that she had never seen anyone look more undone and more certain at the same moment. "Come here," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son with the same steady hands that fixed fences and paid for horses and held her face in the February cold, and he looked at this child with those dark, serious eyes, and the child looked back with the unfocused, ancient attention of someone who has just arrived and is making assessments. "What do we call him?" Elijah asked. "I've been thinking about Thomas," she said. He looked at her. There was no hesitation in him, no jealousy, no complexity. "Thomas Sutton," he said. "Thomas Elijah Sutton," she said. He looked down at the baby again. "Hello, Thomas," he said, and the baby made a sound that Nettie Coles, pulling on her coat near the door, assessed as wind but which both parents chose to interpret as a response. Martha Gale came to visit within the week, as Martha Gale came to all significant events in Harrow Creek, and she held the baby with the confidence of a woman who had held many babies, and said he had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, which seemed probable. And she stayed for 2 hours and told them everything that had happened in town, while they had been occupied with new parenthood. And Louisa let the stream of information wash over her with the comfortable warmth of being embedded in a place, of being known. After Martha left and the baby was sleeping and the house was quiet, Louisa sat on the porch in the spring afternoon with a cup of coffee and looked out across the 100 acres that were hers and Elijah's, the new fields coming in green, the mares with their foals in the south pasture, Calla among them looking magnificently indifferent to the whole enterprise, the roof that did not leak, the fence lined straight and tight, and she felt the weight and the fullness of it all. Elijah came out and sat beside her, and she handed him the coffee cup without being asked because he always wanted coffee and she always made enough for two, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him and they sat in the spring quiet. "I've been thinking," he said. "You're always thinking," she said. "I've been thinking about the north pasture. I think if we put the mares up there through the summer and move the crop rotation east, we get better coverage on the grazing without—" "Elijah," she said. "Yes." "It's Sunday, it is. It is Sunday and there is a baby asleep inside who is going to be awake very shortly, and this is the last peaceful hour either of us is going to have until approximately 1882. Talk to me about the north pasture next Monday." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What would you like to talk about?" "Nothing," she said. "I would like to sit here with you and not talk." He put his chin on the top of her head. "I can do that," he said. They sat in the comfortable silence that was not the absence of things to say, but the presence of enough between them, enough around them, enough ahead of them. And the spring went on doing what spring did, growing things up from the ground with the straightforward insistence of something that knew how to come back from hard times. The years that followed had the shape that good years have, full of detail, full of ordinary days that were not small, full of the work that was also the life. Thomas Elijah Sutton grew into a boy who had his mother's stubbornness and his father's quiet disposition and both of their attachment to the land, which expressed itself from a very early age in his habit of sitting in the dirt of the garden and watching things grow with the patient attention of someone who was genuinely interested in the process. Louisa taught him to read using the same collection of books her father had used with her, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with the lamp between them. And Elijah taught him to ride on Calla, which was the only appropriate horse for the purpose. In 1882, they had a daughter, a girl they named Clara Rose Sutton, and Louisa noticed the way Elijah held her the first time, steady and certain, and with the particular gentleness of a man who had been given something back that he had thought was permanently lost. She named the girl Clara because it was the right thing, and because she understood without requiring explanation that some gifts you give freely because the person receiving them deserves them, and because love is not diminished by acknowledgement of what came before. Clara Rose grew into a child who had her father's eyes and her mother's voice, and an absolutely inexhaustible interest in horses, which made Elijah quietly delighted in the way that only people who have loved something their whole lives can be delighted to find it in someone else. The horse operation expanded through the early 1880s into something that had a reputation in Harrow County for quality. The Sutton horses were known to be well-bred and well-handled, and there was a steadiness to them that buyers recognized and paid for. Louisa's crop operation remained the anchor of the property's financial stability, and together the two enterprises gave them a security that neither of them had experienced alone. Hector Pratt died in 1883 of a heart complaint, and the land he had accumulated through the years passed to a son in San Antonio who had no interest in it and sold it in parcels. One of those parcels, a stretch of good bottomland south of Harrow Creek, was offered to Elijah at fair value, and he bought it, which extended the Sutton operation to 140 acres. Louisa stood at the fence of the new pasture on the day they closed on the purchase and looked at the land stretching south toward the creek, and she thought about the morning of the auction, the weight of the lead rope in her hands, the sky like a bruise. She thought about a man standing at the back of a crowd, paying $100 without blinking, and about Calla blowing warm against her shoulder in the cold. "What are you thinking about?" Elijah asked. He had come to stand beside her the way he always came to stand beside her, without announcement, without fanfare, simply there. "The day of the auction," she said. He was quiet. "I've never properly said this to you," she said. "I've thanked you in a dozen ways for the horse and the fence and the survey and all the rest of it, but I've never said specifically, I am glad it was you standing at the back of that crowd. I'm glad it was your voice I heard. I'm glad the $100 went to you because you gave it back in every way that mattered." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the bottomland that was now theirs. "The truth is," he said, "that morning at the auction was the first morning in 2 years that I wanted something I hadn't expected to want. I drove to town for lumber and I heard there was an auction and I stopped, and I saw you standing there with that horse, and I thought." He stopped. "What did you think?" "I thought, whoever that woman is, she is not going to lose that horse today, not if I can help it." He paused. "I didn't know you then, I didn't know anything about you. I just knew that something was wrong with the situation and I had the means to address it. That's simple. That's simple." She turned to look at him, the profile she had memorized in all its seasons, the jaw, the eyes, the hat still slightly crooked because he had never entirely committed to wearing it straight, and she said, "It wasn't simple at all. You just made it look that way." He turned and looked at her, and the smile was there from the start, the full one, and she thought that she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for all the practical decisions she had made in the right order, for keeping the land, for going to see Whitfield, for calling to him across the fence in the dark. But that the starting point of all of it was a man who saw something wrong and did something about it without being asked, without wanting credit, without anything except the simple conviction that it needed doing. She reached over and took his hand, and he held it with the steadiness she had come to rely on as much as she relied on the land itself, and they stood at the fence of their new pasture in the afternoon light of a Texas spring and looked at the country ahead of them. Thomas was 9 now, and already talking about horses, with the fluency of someone who has found their calling early. Clara Rose was 3 and would follow her brother into any situation without hesitation and with less caution, which was a characteristic that filled her parents with pride and moderate terror in equal measure. The house was warm and large enough, the roof solid, the fields green, the mares fat and well, Calla 23 years old and still bearing in her retirement the magnificence of a horse who knows she has been well loved. There were hard seasons still to come. There always were in this country, in this life. There would be dry summers and flooding springs and market prices that insulted the value of the work. There would be the particular challenges of raising children on a working ranch in West Texas, the education and the safety, and the shaping of 2 people who needed to understand both the beauty and the difficulty of the world they had been born into. There would be the ongoing work of a marriage, which was not the same as a courtship, and was not supposed to be. It was deeper and quieter and more demanding and more sustaining, the long work of building something real with another person. None of this was unknown to either of them. They were not people who expected life to be easy. They were people who had learned that hard things could be survived, and that surviving them with someone beside you was not the same as surviving them alone. On the evening of the day they bought the new pasture, Louisa stood at the kitchen stove and made dinner while Thomas did his reading at the table, and Clara Rose sat on the floor with the barn cat, and Elijah came in from the last round of the stock, hanging his hat on the hook by the door with the automatic gesture of a man who had hung his hat in the same place for 6 years. He came to stand behind Louisa at the stove and put his hands on her shoulders and looked over her head at the pot. "That smells like venison stew," he said. "It is venison stew," she said. "I thought you were going to cook something that wasn't venison stew. That was 5 years ago. I've clearly expanded my repertoire since and come back around to the best option." He made a sound that was half laugh and wholly fond and pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and she leaned back against him for a moment and felt the solidity of him, the warmth and the steadiness and the full, unambiguous reality of this person who had walked into the back of a crowd one morning, with no agenda except to pay attention to what was in front of him and do what was right. The sun went down over Harrow Creek, and the lamps came on in the kitchen, and the house was full of the sound of 2 children and 1 contented barn cat, and the smell of a good dinner. And outside in the pasture, Calla stood in the last of the evening light with the permanent composure of a very old horse who has been in several homes and known several kinds of kindness, and has settled at last into the place where she will always be. The spring rains came that night, soft and steady, and the roof held as it always held now, and the land drank it in with the straightforward gratitude of something that knows what it needs. Louisa lay in the dark with Elijah's arm across her and listened to the rain on the good solid roof of the house they had made together, and she thought, "This is what enough looks like. This is the whole shape of it," and she understood with the clarity that only comes to people who have known the other thing, who have stood on the auction block holding on by one hand, that this exact particular life, impractical and demanding and full beyond measure, was not what she had settled for. It was what she had fought for. It was what she had earned. It was what she would go on earning every season, every year, in the company of a man who had understood that truth from the back of a crowd on a bruise-colored morning, and had acted on it without being asked, and had never stopped. The rain fell on the 140 acres that were entirely, irrevocably theirs. The horses stood quiet in the pasture. Thomas slept with one arm flung wide, the way he always slept, like someone embracing the air. Clara Rose slept with the barn cat curled against her feet, which would have been a problem if either of them had ever cared. And in the kitchen, on the table where so many good conversations had happened and would happen again, the lamp burned low in the old Texas way, warm and patient, holding the light for as long as it was needed.